cold November afternoon in 1971, the lights inside the List family's grand Victorian mansion in Westfield, New Jersey, suddenly went dark. The curtains were drawn tight, the mail piled high, and for nearly a month, no one saw the devout accountant John Emil List, his wife Helen, or their 3 children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. When police finally entered the home on December 7th, the silence felt suffocating. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, filling the house with eerie calm. Then, in the ballroom, officers found 5 bodies laid out in perfect alignment, covered with towels, their faces peaceful. Each had been shot once. Nearby sat a note addressed to John's pastor. It began, "By now you have realized what I have done." To neighbors, the Lists were the model suburban family, church-going, polite, distant, but respectable. John was a devout Lutheran, a Sunday school teacher who led prayers before dinner and spoke often about salvation. But behind the pristine facade was a man drowning in pride and panic. He had lost his job months earlier and couldn't bear the shame of failure. His wife's health was deteriorating. His daughter had dreams of becoming an actress, something John considered sinful. And above all, he feared that his family's souls were drifting away from God. In his mind, there was only one solution: to send them to heaven before they could fall into sin. The letter he left behind, 11 pages long, revealed a chilling blend of calculation and conviction. He detailed his financial ruin, lamented the moral decay of modern America, and explained that he could no longer watch his family suffer in spiritual decline. He believed killing them would ensure their salvation. "I know it may sound cowardly," he wrote, "but it was the only way to keep them from hell." Investigators pieced together the methodical precision of the crime. On November 9th, John sent his children to school as usual. That morning, he shot his wife in the kitchen, then his mother upstairs. When his daughter and younger son came home from school, he killed them too, calmly, one by one. His eldest, John Jr., was shot last after returning from soccer practice. Forensic reports later showed that John Jr. struggled. He'd been shot multiple times, as if his father hesitated to finish. Afterward, John cleaned up the scene, lined the bodies neatly in the ballroom, turned on the house intercom to play religious hymns, and disappeared. Before leaving, he cut his image from every family photo, a deliberate act to slow police identification. Then he vanished without a trace. The mansion sat dark for nearly a month before neighbors finally grew suspicious. By then, John List was already gone, having driven to the airport, abandoned his car, and taken on a new identity. To police, it was as if he'd evaporated, but to those who knew him, it was the ultimate act of control. He'd spent his entire life crafting perfection, the perfect family, the perfect faith, the perfect man. And when that illusion began to crack, he destroyed the evidence. For nearly 2 decades, John List would remain one of America's most elusive fugitives, the man who killed not out of rage, but out of righteousness. But his story was far from over, because 18 years later, in a quiet Denver suburb, someone would recognize the face of Bob Clark, and the mask of John List would finally slip. For nearly 18 years, John Emil List was a ghost. The murders of his family in 1971 had stunned the nation, but by the time the police pieced together what had happened inside that dark New Jersey mansion, List had already vanished without a trace. The FBI followed leads across the country. Every accountant named John, every missing church treasurer, every middle-aged man with military ties. Nothing stuck. The trail went cold. Over the years, the case became a grim curiosity on true crime shows and cold case boards. The devout father who murdered for salvation, then disappeared like smoke. Behind that myth, John List had quietly rebuilt his life. He moved from place to place under the alias Robert Peter Clark. Using his background in accounting and his calm, conservative demeanor, he found work easily and slipped back into society unnoticed. In Denver, Colorado, he met a widow named Dolores Miller at a church social. They married in 1985 and settled in Richmond, Virginia, living in a tidy suburban home, attending church, and volunteering for community events. No one ever suspected that Bob Clark was a mass murderer. It wasn't until 1989 that the past finally caught up with him. That year, the producers from the television program, America's Most Wanted, decided to feature the long-forgotten List case. They commissioned forensic sculptor Frank Bender to create an age-progressed clay bust showing what John might look like after nearly 2 decades on the run. Bender's model captured eerie details, thicker glasses, receding hairline, a heavier jaw, but still the same cold, meticulous eyes. When the episode aired on May 21st, when questioned, he denied everything, insisting he was not John List. But fingerprints taken from his old military records told the truth. After 18 years, the man who'd written a letter to his pastor about saving his family's souls was finally in custody. At his 1990 trial, prosecutors laid bare the full scope of his planning. They showed how List had cancelled the mail, cut out his photos, and turned off the lights to make it look as if the family had gone away on vacation. Psychiatrists testified that he suffered from obsessive-compulsive traits and delusional religiosity, a man whose pride and moral rigidity eclipsed empathy. List took the stand, soft-spoken and emotionless. He admitted the killings but refused to call them murders. "I feel that what I did was wrong," he told the court, "but I felt I had to protect them from the world's evils." He claimed he'd prayed for forgiveness every day since. The jury took less than 2 days to convict him on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 5 consecutive life terms, calling the crimes meticulously calculated and devoid of humanity. When asked if he felt remorse, List said, "I wish none of it had happened, but I believe God has forgiven me." He died in prison in 2008, never expressing remorse beyond that carefully measured line. Today, the John List case endures not just as a story of mass murder, but as a parable of control, a man so consumed by perfection and fear of failure that he became judge, jury, and executioner for his own family. Behind the pious veneer of faith and order, John List had been something else entirely, a man who mistook salvation for ownership, and fatherhood for the right to decide who lives and who dies. When police first entered the small Austrian town of Amstetten in April 2008, they had no idea they were about to uncover one of the most horrifying secrets in modern history. A nightmare that had lived not in some distant forest or remote island, but under the floorboards of a quiet family home. The man at the center of it all was Josef Fritzl, a 73-year-old retired engineer with a reputation for discipline and self-reliance. To his neighbors, he was strict but respectable, the kind of man who kept his hedges trimmed and his property immaculate. He owned multiple buildings, ran small businesses, and often bragged about his technical skills. No one questioned what went on in the basement of his large house, because Fritzl never gave anyone a reason to. But behind the concrete walls and locked doors lay a secret chamber he had built decades earlier, a hidden network of soundproof rooms accessible through a steel door disguised behind a shelf. Inside, for 24 years, he kept his own daughter, Elizabeth, captive. The story began in 90 years past, and letters, all written in Elizabeth's handwriting, began arriving, postmarked from other towns. They pleaded with the family not to look for her. But they weren't sent by Elizabeth. They were dictated by Josef himself, read aloud through the very trapdoor that kept her imprisoned. Down in the basement, Elizabeth lived in darkness. The space was barely 6 feet high, with no windows, no sunlight. Over time, she gave birth to 7 children, all fathered by Fritzl. 3 were kept with her underground. The others were taken upstairs by Josef, who claimed they had been left on his doorstep by Elizabeth. The deception was so elaborate that even social workers praised him for adopting abandoned children. For decades, the illusion held. Fritzl maintained 2 lives, the respected patriarch above ground and the tyrant below. He controlled every moment of Elizabeth's existence, when she ate, when she slept, when she spoke. He rationed food, turned off electricity as punishment, and threatened to flood the cellar with gas if she disobeyed. It wasn't until April 2008 that the secret finally broke. One of the underground children, Kirsten, became gravely ill. After days of panic, Fritzl brought her to a hospital, claiming she was his granddaughter. But her malnutrition and strange medical history raised alarms. Doctors appealed on national television for the child's mother to come forward, and when Elizabeth saw the broadcast on a small basement TV, she begged Fritzl to let her go. Under pressure, he relented, and that decision unraveled everything. When Elizabeth appeared at the hospital with the other hidden children, staff immediately contacted police. After 24 years in captivity, she whispered a single sentence that shattered Austria's innocence. "Don't let him hurt us again." Police raided the house and found the reinforced steel door. Behind it, the world descended into silence. Cramped rooms, old toys, a calendar frozen in the 1980s. It was a crime beyond comprehension. A father who turned protection into imprisonment, who built hell beneath his own home. As news spread, Amstetten became the epicenter of global outrage. Reporters swarmed the quiet street. Psychologists called it the most complete domination of a human being ever documented. The facade of family life, perfectly maintained for decades, had been nothing but a cover for pure control. But the story was only half told, because when Fritzl was finally arrested and questioned, his words revealed something even darker. A man who didn't see himself as a monster at all. When Josef Fritzl was taken into custody in April 2008, he appeared calm, polite, almost cooperative. He asked police for coffee. He thanked them for being professional. Only when detectives confronted him with DNA results proving that the 6 surviving children were both his and Elizabeth's did the facade crack. Then, in a monotone, he said, "Yes, I am the father." For Austria, a nation that prided itself on privacy, order, and moral discipline, the confession detonated like a bomb. Within days, the modest town of Amstetten was surrounded by satellite vans. Headlines screamed about the dungeon father. Psychologists, priests, and sociologists crowded television panels, trying to explain how such horror could thrive undetected beneath an ordinary home. Fritzl's interrogation transcripts later revealed a mind built on control. He described constructing the cellar himself in the early 1980s, installing steel doors and a secret electrical system. He called the underground rooms his second life. He said he had protected Elizabeth from the world and provided for her children. When investigators asked if he understood the trauma he'd inflicted, he replied, "I always brought them food. I never beat them. I kept them safe." That chilling logic carried into his 2000. The charges read like a moral indictment of humanity itself. Murder, rape, incest, false imprisonment, enslavement, and coercion. Elizabeth, after 24 years of silence, testified via video link from a secure location. Her statement was devastating. She spoke softly, but every word was precise. The births, the punishments, the fear of dying underground. She described how one baby died shortly after birth, and how she begged her father to get help. Instead, Fritzl disposed of the infant's body in an incinerator. That act formed the basis of the murder charge. Prosecutors painted him as a man obsessed with absolute power, someone who saw both his home and his daughter as property to be managed. The defense argued he had been a product of post-war trauma and suffered from a disordered need for control. But the jury saw through the pretense. After just 4 days, Fritzl changed his plea to guilty on all counts. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the sentence: life imprisonment in a psychiatric facility. He was ordered to spend the rest of his days at the secure institution in Golersdorf, Austria's prison hospital for the criminally insane. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered with candles. One sign read, "No God lived in that house." Another, "Justice for the forgotten years." For Elizabeth and her children, the aftermath was a slow process of reclaiming life. They were relocated to a new home under police protection, given new identities, and placed under 24-hour psychiatric care. Reports years later said they found small joys: gardening, music, sunlight. The youngest children saw the sky for the first time at ages 12 and 16. The Amstetten basement was later sealed and filled with concrete. Authorities wanted to ensure no one could ever enter it again. The house, once a monument to secrecy, became a warning, proof that evil can hide behind polite curtains and tidy hedges. In interviews after his conviction, Fritzl never expressed remorse. He said only, "I was born to be strict. I brought order to chaos." That single sentence captured the horror of the case, not madness, but the cold conviction of a man who mistook domination for discipline, faith for ownership. Every week, we uncover cases that defies logic. Behind each episode are hours of research, scripting, and editing to make sure every detail you hear is true. What you're watching isn't entertainment. It's real documentary work that remembers the victims and exposes the silence around them. Hit subscribe. It's free for you, but it helps us keep investigating, narrating, and preserving the stories the world would rather erase. And Fatherhood for the Right to Play God. Christmas week, 1987. While families across America prepared for joy and reunion, one man in Russellville, Arkansas, prepared for something else entirely: annihilation. His name was Ronald Gene Simmons, a 47-year-old retired Air Force sergeant whose rage, paranoia, and need for control had festered for decades. By the time his rampage was over, he would murder 16 people, including 14 members of his own family. Simmons had once been described as quiet, disciplined, even ordinary. He had served 20 years in the military, raised 7 children, and lived by strict rules. But beneath that order was obsession. He demanded obedience from his wife, Rebecca, and his children. He kept them isolated, forbidding outside friendships, church attendance, or dating. By the early 1980s, he had uprooted the entire family to a remote patch of land near Dover, Arkansas, where he built a crude compound of trailers and scrap lumber he called Mockingbird Hill. There was no phone, no plumbing, and no privacy. To outsiders, it looked like poverty. To those inside, it was captivity. Neighbors rarely saw the family, but rumors circulated that Simmons had an unnatural fixation on one of his daughters, Sheila, that his wife seemed terrified of him, that the children looked withdrawn, malnourished. In 1981, investigators opened an incest and abuse inquiry, but Simmons fled before charges could be filed. By the time authorities found him again, witnesses were too afraid to testify. The case quietly died, and so did any chance of stopping what came next. By 1987, the family dynamic had collapsed. Simmons, unemployed and seething, blamed everyone for his failures: the government, his bosses, his wife, and even his children. He wrote letters railing against betrayal and sin. Then, just before Christmas, he decided to end it. On December 22nd, his eldest son, Gene Jr., arrived with his wife and child to celebrate the holidays. Simmons greeted them calmly, then shot them both. Over the next 2 days, as each family member returned home, his wife, his children, his grandchildren, he executed them methodically, one by one, using a handgun and a crowbar. He placed their bodies in neat rows in the living room, covered with coats and blankets. When his house could hold no more, he stacked others in an abandoned pit outside. The killings were chillingly deliberate. He didn't drink. He didn't panic. He ate meals between murders. He later told investigators he wanted peace. After killing 14 relatives, Simmons stayed in the blood-soaked home for 4 days. On December 28th, he shaved, dressed neatly, and drove into nearby Russellville. There, he entered the offices of a former employer, a small law firm, and killed his former supervisor. He walked next door and shot a woman who had rejected him romantically, then continued to another oil company where he wounded a couple of clerks. Finally, he walked into a local convenience store, calmly laid his gun on the counter, and said, "I've done enough. Call the police." When officers arrived, he didn't resist. They later said he seemed almost relieved. He refused to eat, refused a lawyer, and when asked why he did it, replied simply, "They were all turning against me. I had to stop it before it went any further." That statement, cold, rational, terrifying, captured the psychology of a patriarch collapsing under his own delusion. For Simmons, control was everything. When he could no longer command loyalty through fear, he decided that death was preferable to disobedience. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a final act of ownership. And in the courtroom that followed, his lack of remorse would stun even seasoned investigators, a man who saw murder not as rage, but as resolution. When Ronald Gene Simmons surrendered on December 28, 1987, the people of Arkansas were left with a question that seemed unanswerable. Why? There had been no standoff, no wild chase, no outward sign of insanity. Just a man who had calmly exterminated everyone who carried his name. At first, investigators believed the killings might be part of a larger financial or cult motive. But inside the ruins of Mockingbird Hill, the evidence told a different story. Handwritten notes, utility receipts, and meticulous lists showed a man obsessed with control. He kept ledgers of every bullet fired, every item bought, every person accounted for. To Simmons, family was not a bond, it was inventory. When detectives questioned him, he spoke softly, in full sentences, as if discussing routine chores. He said his wife had nagged him for years, that his children disrespected him, and that Christmas was the right time to finish it. One investigator later said, "It was like interviewing a man who'd just finished mowing his lawn. No remorse. No confusion. Just completion." His first trial began in May 1988 for the murders committed in Russellville, 2 co-workers and the wounded victims. Even in handcuffs, he was unnervingly polite, addressing the judge as "Sir." He refused to plead insanity and rejected all attempts at an appeal. When asked whether he wished to contest the death penalty, he told his lawyers to stop speaking on his behalf. To appeal, he said, would be to prolong the inevitable. Psychiatrists called by the state described him as suffering from narcissistic and paranoid traits, a man who believed the world was conspiring to humiliate him. When his family no longer obeyed, their existence became proof of his failure. His murders, the experts said, were an act of purification, an attempt to erase shame by erasing witnesses. During testimony, survivors from Russellville recounted how Simmons had walked into their offices carrying a gun and a chilling calm. One woman remembered his words precisely: "You ruined my life." He had once asked her for a date. She had declined. To Simmons, that slight joined a lifetime of perceived betrayals. The killings were his corrections. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death by lethal injection for the Russellville murders, plus additional life terms for the family killings. But Simmons made headlines again when he refused to appeal, a right automatically granted to every death row prisoner. He told reporters, "I deserve it. It's time to go." The state appointed lawyers to appeal on his behalf anyway. He sued them to stop. The courts eventually ruled he was competent to waive further review. On June 25, 1990, in the death chamber at the Arkansas Department of Correction, Simmons declined a final statement. Witnesses described him closing his eyes as the chemicals flowed. The man who had once written grocery-style lists of the people he planned to kill was finally still. He was executed at 9 p.m., the first Arkansan to die by lethal injection. Even decades later, criminologists cite Simmons as the textbook case of patriarchal collapse, a man whose identity was built entirely on dominance. When that structure failed, he destroyed everything within it. His massacre remains the largest family killing in U.S. history by a single perpetrator. Neighbors never returned to Mockingbird Hill. The property was bulldozed, the earth seeded over, as if erasing the blueprint of madness. But the lesson it left behind endures. When control becomes a creed and pride becomes prayer, the house built on obedience will always collapse from within. In the quiet highways and service stations of 1980s Britain, few people noticed the blue delivery van that often appeared near schools, swimming pools, and playgrounds. It belonged to Robert Black, a Scottish long-haul driver who hauled advertising posters across the United Kingdom. To most, he was just another road worker, solitary, punctual, invisible. But behind that steering wheel sat one of the most calculating child predators Europe had ever known. Born in Grangemouth, Scotland, in 1947, Robert Black grew up in state care after his mother abandoned him at birth. His childhood was marked by abuse, isolation, and obsession. By his teens, he had already shown disturbing tendencies, fixations on young girls, petty thefts, and voyeurism. Yet in adulthood, he found the perfect camouflage for his sickness, a delivery job that gave him mobility, anonymity, and access. Black's roots took him from London to Edinburgh, through small towns and rural roads where children walked home alone. He blended into the background, his company uniform and delivery schedule providing the perfect alibi. Between 1981 and 1986, at least 4 known victims, Susan Maxwell, Caroline Hogg, Sarah Harper, and Jennifer Cardy, vanished during his journeys. Each was between 5 and 11 years old. Each disappeared within minutes of being seen alive. The crimes baffled police. There were no witnesses, no consistent geographic pattern, no clear motive. But what linked them all was timing. The victims vanished within hours of Black's delivery stops. It would take nearly a decade of cross-border detective work, forensic breakthroughs, and geographic profiling to expose the pattern. The first known case was Jennifer Cardy, a 9-year-old from Northern Ireland. She left home to ride her bike to a friend's house. Her body was found 6 days later in a reservoir. The next, Susan Maxwell, disappeared in 1982 near the England-Scotland border. Forensic soil analysis later matched particles from her shoes to dirt traced to Scotland, a clue that the killer was mobile. Then came Caroline Hogg in 1983, last seen leaving a fairground in Edinburgh, and Sarah Harper in 1986 from Leeds. Each case carried the same eerie signature: abduction in daylight, disappearance near major motorways, recovery of the victim's body miles away. Police formed a multi-agency task force, mapping every long-haul delivery route, interviewing thousands of drivers, and cross-referencing fuel receipts. It was one of the largest child murder investigations in UK history, but for years, they had only fragments, tire marks, witness sketches, vague sightings of a man in a van. In July, inside was Robert Black, and in the back, a terrified 6-year-old girl, bound and gagged inside a sleeping bag. She had been abducted minutes earlier. Police stopped the van within the hour, rescuing the child and arresting Black on the spot. Inside his vehicle, Detectives found ropes, restraints, maps, and detailed travel logs, trophies of his prior crimes. The evidence from the van would later match forensic samples from multiple murder scenes. Black had finally been caught, not through confession or mistake, but through persistence and coincidence colliding at the right moment. When police traced his previous routes, the pattern became undeniable. Wherever Black had driven, a child had disappeared. Investigators built a forensic map connecting hundreds of delivery stops to known abductions across Britain and Ireland. It was a dark cartography of opportunity. The public was horrified, not just by the brutality, but by the normalcy of the man behind it. He wasn't a stranger in the night. He was the delivery man they passed every morning. And as the trial would soon reveal, even in prison, Robert Black showed no remorse, only irritation that he had been caught. When Robert Black was finally brought to trial in 1994, Britain had already spent a decade haunted by his crimes. The headlines called him the man in the van, a predator who turned everyday roads into hunting grounds. The courtroom, packed with parents, journalists, and detectives who had spent years tracing his movements, felt less like a trial and more like the unmasking of a ghost. Black sat in the dock, head lowered, impassive. There was no trace of guilt or emotion, only the flat stare of a man who had lived decades without empathy. Prosecutors methodically laid out the forensic evidence that had finally tied his traveling life to death itself. Investigators had used forensic mapping, a revolutionary technique at the time, to reconstruct every delivery route Black had driven between. When the data was layered with the locations of unsolved abductions, the pattern was undeniable. The same van, the same highways, the same driver. Forensic fibers from Black's van matched materials found on the victim's clothing. Soil and pollen samples linked the bodies to locations where his truck had stopped. His fuel purchase history placed him within miles of every abduction within minutes of disappearance. The precision of the evidence shocked even seasoned investigators. It was the first time geographic profiling in the UK had fully solved a serial child abduction case. One detective described the process as mapping evil. The prosecution introduced photographs of the van's interior, a single mattress, rope, duct tape, and a small mirror fixed to the ceiling, all part of Black's ritualized control. They also presented a notebook found in his flat, containing the names of towns and initials believed to correspond to prior victims. He denied everything, claiming the items were work supplies. The jury took less than 5 hours to convict him on multiple counts of kidnapping and murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that he never be released. The judge called him a danger to every child in Britain. Over the next decade, further investigations connected him to additional unsolved murders across the UK and Europe, including in the Netherlands and France. In 2011, at a later trial in Northern Ireland, he was convicted of the 1978 murder of Jennifer Cardy, thanks to new DNA and fiber analysis. Even as the evidence mounted, Black remained unrepentant. In prison, he refused interviews, rarely spoke to guards, and maintained the quiet mechanical demeanor that had allowed him to operate unnoticed for years. Psychologists who evaluated him described a complete absence of empathy, calling him a predatory opportunist of extreme organization. Robert Black died in prison in 2016, found unresponsive in his cell at age 60. For many families, his death brought no closure. Several unsolved cases are still believed to be linked to his roots. Detectives who worked the case said the investigation changed policing forever. It pioneered cross-border cooperation, data-driven profiling, and forensic route mapping that later became standard in modern law enforcement. The case also shattered a collective illusion that monsters could be identified by chaos or cruelty. Robert Black showed the opposite. He was organized, ordinary, and invisible. A man whose job gave him access to every town, whose van became a moving crime scene. As one detective said at his sentencing, he was not the stranger parents warned their children about. He was the man they waved to as he delivered their mail. In the end, Robert Black's crimes forced the world to confront a new kind of evil, not the dramatic, but the mundane. The evil that hides in plain sight. On August 13, 2018, a Colorado oil worker named Chris Watts called his wife and daughters missing. He stood before TV cameras, begging for their safe return, the devoted husband, the grieving father. But as his neighbors watched the footage, many whispered the same thing. Something felt off. Behind that calm voice and neatly pressed shirt was a man hiding one of the most disturbing suburban crimes in recent history. The destruction of his own family, carried out not in rage, but in cold calculation. Chris and Shanann Watts seemed to embody modern domestic perfection. Their Facebook pages showed smiling family photos, home videos, and cheerful posts about love, marriage, and their 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste. Shanann was pregnant with a 3rd child, a boy they planned to name Nico. From the outside, theirs was a life built on order, affection, and faith. But underneath, debt was mounting, tensions were rising, and Chris was living a double life. He'd begun an affair with a coworker, telling her he was separated. To his friends, he appeared quieter than usual. To his wife, distant. Shanann sensed something was wrong. Her final text messages, sent from a business trip, read like warnings from intuition. "I feel like you don't care anymore. Something's changed." That night, she returned home. Hours later, she and the children were gone. When police arrived after a friend reported Shanann missing, the house looked undisturbed. No sign of struggle, her car still in the garage, her purse and phone untouched. Chris greeted officers calmly, even offered to help with the search. Body cam footage captured his strange composure. Hands on his knees, breathing steady, giving rehearsed answers. But detectives noticed small cracks. His story shifted under gentle questioning. Where he'd been, when he last saw Shanann, what they'd argued about. Neighbors told police the couple had been fighting. Security footage from across the street showed something chilling. Early that morning, Chris backing his truck into the garage for several minutes, long enough to load something heavy. Within hours, suspicion turned inward. Investigators used polygraphs, data from Shanann's phone, and GPS logs from Chris's work truck. The evidence began to form a timeline. His calm unraveled when an agent leaned in and said softly, "Chris, we know you're lying." He broke. First, he claimed Shanann had killed the children, and he had reacted. But the truth, as it came out in confession tapes days later, was far darker. He strangled Shanann in their bedroom, then smothered Bella and Celeste in the back seat of his truck, driving with their bodies to a remote oil field where he buried his wife in a shallow grave and placed his daughters' bodies in oil tanks. When asked why, his answer stunned even investigators. "I wanted to start over." The motive wasn't rage, money, or madness. It was emptiness. He wanted a new life, a new woman, a clean slate. To him, family wasn't love, it was weight. The story ignited national obsession. The footage of his interviews, his shifting tone, his false composure, became viral study material for body language experts and psychologists. What frightened people most wasn't his brutality, it was his normalcy. He wasn't a drifter or a known abuser. He was a neighbor mowing his lawn, a dad at a birthday party, a man who smiled for family photos hours before erasing the family itself. When the details of his confession were released, America realized it had witnessed a murder disguised as a marriage. And when the trial began, the only question left was how a man could destroy everything he claimed to love, with a voice calm enough to call it a mistake. When Chris Watts finally confessed, it wasn't in anger, it was in exhaustion. For days, he had tried to maintain the illusion of innocence. He gave interviews, walked calmly through his empty house with police, and described his missing wife and children in the past tense without realizing it. But when confronted with the mounting evidence, his voice cracked under the weight of his own lies. The turning point came in a small interrogation room at the Frederick Police Department. Detectives played the recording of his polygraph, which he had failed spectacularly, and leaned in. "Chris," one agent said softly, "this doesn't make sense. Help us understand what really happened." Hours of footage from that night later became the stuff of internet analysis. Every sigh, every half smile, every pause between his words was dissected by millions. It wasn't just a confession, it was the collapse of a mask. Watts first told investigators that he and Shanann had argued, and that she had hurt the kids. It was a desperate lie meant to preserve a shred of sympathy. But when his father entered the room, and detectives urged him to tell the truth, his composure broke. His shoulders slumped, his voice dropped to a whisper. "I killed her." Over the next hours, he described, almost clinically, how he had strangled Shanann in their bed. When detectives asked what he did next, he said, "I loaded them up." The phrase hung in the air, a father referring to his wife and children as if they were objects. The full truth came later, during a post-conviction interview in prison. He had killed Shanann after she confronted him about the affair, then smothered Bella and Celeste in the back seat of his truck. The girl's final words, he said, were, "Daddy, No. To the public, the horror wasn't just in the act, but in the calmness that followed. After disposing of their bodies at an oil site owned by his employer, Watts went to work. He chatted with coworkers, texted friends, and even messaged his mistress as if nothing had happened. That night, he called real estate agents to discuss selling the house. When those details emerged, the story became a global obsession. Cable networks looped his interviews beside police footage, showing the transformation in real time, the smiling father to the emotionless killer. Online, true crime forums and psychologists dissected every gesture. Some called him a narcissistic void, others a family annihilator, driven not by hatred, but by the fantasy of freedom. In November 2018, Chris Watts pled guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder, plus charges of unlawful termination of a pregnancy and tampering with a body. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without parole. In court, he barely lifted his eyes. Shannan's parents spoke of forgiveness but said his actions forever destroyed generations. From behind bars, Watts has given few interviews. Each time, his tone remains eerily steady, a man still describing horror as if reading a grocery list. Prison psychologists say he fits the classic profile of a pathological avoidant, a man who sought peace through erasure, order through destruction. Outside the prison walls, their house in Frederick, Colorado still stands. The toys in the yard, the welcome mat, the perfect suburban silence, all reminders of the illusion he crafted and then obliterated. The case endures not just because of what he did, but because of what he looked like while doing it. Normal, loving, ordinary. A husband who smiled for photos, then killed the life inside them. In the end, Chris Watts didn't destroy his family out of hatred. He did it out of emptiness, the quiet horror of a man who mistook freedom for annihilation. On the surface, John Sharp looked like the picture of Australian suburban normalcy, an average man in his late 30s, living with his wife Anna Kemp and their baby daughter, Gracie, in the quiet coastal town of Mornington, Victoria. He worked a stable job, played golf on weekends, and appeared, to neighbors, polite if somewhat withdrawn. But beneath the surface of that neat home was a man slowly eroding under resentment and control. By early 2004, Sharp's marriage was collapsing. Friends later recalled that Anna, a vibrant and outgoing woman, had grown frustrated with her husband's emotional distance. Sharp, for his part, complained privately about her nagging and about the demands of fatherhood. When Anna gave birth to their daughter, who had a minor hip condition requiring a brace, he became obsessed with the inconvenience, fixated on the sound of the brace clicking as she moved. It was a small detail, but for a man already unraveling, it became a symbol of his perceived entrapment. On March 23, 2004, after yet another argument, John Sharp made a purchase that would later define his infamy, a high-powered spear gun, bought from a local sporting goods store. The clerk remembered him as calm, methodical, a man who knew exactly what he wanted. That night, as Anna slept, Sharp loaded the weapon and fired a spear into her head. When she didn't die immediately, he fired a second shot. Then, in an act both horrifying and coldly practical, he removed the projectiles and buried them in the garden. The following day, he wrapped her body in a tarp and buried her beneath the backyard patio. For the next several days, Sharp went through the motions of daily life. He sent text messages from Anna's phone to family and friends, pretending she had left him to sort things out. He even forged an email saying she had gone to her mother's home in New Zealand. But the horror didn't end there. 6 days after killing his wife, Sharp turned his attention to his 20-month-old daughter, Gracie. He later told police he found her difficult to handle. That night, he used the same spear gun to kill her as she lay in her cot. He buried her beside her mother, then covered the graves with soil and gravel, restoring the patio as if nothing had changed. In the weeks that followed, Sharp played the role of concerned husband. He filed a missing persons report, spoke with journalists, and gave interviews pleading for Anna's return. In one broadcast, he stood in front of his home and told cameras, "Anna, if you're watching this, please come home. Gracie misses you." His tone was flat, but no one yet suspected the truth. Detectives began to sense inconsistencies, phone records that didn't add up, banking activity that ceased abruptly, Sharp's mechanical demeanor in interviews. He failed to provide convincing details about Anna's supposed departure. When police questioned him about the missing spears from his equipment, he claimed they'd been lost while fishing. By June, forensic investigators focused on the family home. Ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies beneath the patio. When officers began digging, Sharp broke. In a quiet voice, he confessed, "They're both there." The discovery stunned the nation. The idea that a father could calmly annihilate his family and live above their graves for months seemed unthinkable. Australian media called him the spear gun killer, a name that would follow him for the rest of his life. Sharp's demeanor during questioning chilled even seasoned detectives. He spoke of the murders as if recounting chores, no rage, no remorse, only a desire to explain his logic. He said he believed killing Anna would end the arguments, and that Gracie couldn't live without her mother. When the case went public, Australia recoiled. It wasn't just the brutality of the act, it was the cold rationality. A father who smiled for cameras while standing above the bodies of his wife and daughter. A man who mistook silence for peace. As one reporter wrote, John Sharp didn't just bury his family, he buried the illusion that evil always looks unhinged. When detectives finally uncovered the bodies buried beneath the patio of the Mornington home, Australia froze. The case of John Sharp, the spear gun killer, was no longer a missing persons mystery. It was a portrait of evil so cold it seemed mechanical. Sharp's confession, recorded in meticulous detail, became one of the most unsettling statements in Australian criminal history. Sitting in a grey interview room, he explained not only what he had done, but how calmly he had planned it. He spoke without emotion, about waiting for Anna to fall asleep, about the noise of the spear gun, about washing the sheets afterward. When asked why he killed his baby daughter 6 days later, he said simply, "She was a burden. I couldn't cope." Detectives later said his demeanor was eerily polite, almost helpful, as if he were clarifying facts for an accountant's audit. There were no signs of psychosis, no sudden bursts of anger, just detachment. That stillness haunted investigators long after the interview ended. As news spread, Australia reacted with disbelief and fury. Talk shows, newspapers, and community forums filled with outrage. Mothers wept on air, unable to comprehend how a father could turn a spear gun on his infant child. Psychologists called it a murder of convenience, an act driven not by impulse, but by control and self-preservation. During his trial in 2005, Sharp initially pleaded not guilty, citing mental strain and temporary loss of reason. But as prosecutors laid out the evidence, the forged texts, the spear gun purchase, the buried bodies, his story crumbled. Facing overwhelming proof and public disgust, he changed his plea to guilty on 2 counts of murder. In court, Sharp appeared small and pale. He avoided eye contact, responding in monotone as the judge recited the details of his crimes. The courtroom fell silent when prosecutors played footage of his televised appeal, the moment when he had stood before cameras, asking Anna to come home. To many in the gallery, it was the most chilling evidence of all. A murderer publicly performing concern while standing over the graves of his wife and child. Justice Bernard Bongiorno, in delivering the sentence, described the crimes as beyond comprehension and a betrayal of the most basic human duty. He sentenced Sharp to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 24 years, one of the harshest penalties in Victorian legal history at the time. For the Kemp family, justice was hollow. Anna's mother later said, "He didn't just take their lives, he took our peace, our trust, and every tomorrow we should have had with them." In the aftermath, Australia entered a national period of reflection. The case reignited discussions about domestic homicide, male emotional suppression, and the warning signs of possessive control. Community organizations launched campaigns urging people to take sudden disappearances and inconsistent stories seriously. Years later, criminologists revisiting the case called Sharp's murders an act of annihilation disguised as order. To him, the killings were a way to eliminate what he saw as problems, to restore quiet. But in doing so, he exposed something far louder, the horror of emptiness masquerading as rationality. Today, John Sharp remains in a maximum security prison in Victoria. His name rarely appears in media anymore, but his case continues to surface in documentaries and university courses as a symbol of domestic betrayal and the darkness that can fester behind suburban normality. Every time the footage of his fake TV appeal resurfaces online, it provokes the same reaction: disbelief that a man could stand in front of his home, eyes blank, asking the world to help find the family he had buried with his own hands. Because in that moment, John Sharp didn't just lie to a nation. He lied to the very idea of what fatherhood means. In the mid-1990s, Belgium discovered that one of its own had been hiding a nightmare in plain sight. Marc Dutroux, a father of 3 and former electrician, looked like any other middle-class man from the industrial city of Charleroi. He smiled at neighbors, tinkered with cars, and claimed to be raising his children responsibly. But beneath that ordinary exterior was a subterranean world of captivity and cruelty that would shake an entire nation. Police first knew his name in the 1980s for car theft and small-time abductions. He had already served prison time for kidnapping and assaulting young girls, yet by 1992 he was free, a decision that would become one of Belgium's greatest judicial failures. Using his knowledge of construction, Dutroux secretly built hidden cells beneath his house in Marcinelle, soundproof and lined with metal plating. He installed fake walls, hidden doors, and even ventilation ducts disguised as household pipes. Between posters appeared on street corners, families pleaded on national television, and police searched rivers and train stations. Few suspected that the missing children were only meters away from the investigators, trapped beneath Dutroux's floorboards. The horror unraveled when 2 of the victims, Sabine Dardenne, 12, and Laetitia Delhez, 14, were rescued alive. Officers, acting on a tip about a suspicious van, raided Dutroux's property and followed a faint sound, a girl's voice calling from behind a false wall. When they broke through, they found a narrow chamber barely wide enough for a child to stand. Inside, Sabine and Laetitia had been kept for weeks, surviving on scraps and the promise that they'd soon go home. What police uncovered next defied comprehension. In a second property, they found the bodies of 4 other girls, buried in shallow graves. Among them were Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau, who had disappeared 2 years earlier. Autopsies revealed that they had starved to death while Dutroux served a brief jail sentence for theft, their captor too absent or too indifferent to feed them. Investigators also arrested his wife, Michelle Martin, who admitted to knowing about the captives but claimed she was too frightened to intervene. The couple's chilling domesticity, raising their own children while torturing others, became the ultimate symbol of moral collapse. Public outrage exploded. How had a convicted predator been released early? Why had multiple tips about his van and basement gone ignored? And how could authorities lose surveillance on a man already under investigation for child abduction? Belgium erupted in what became known as the White March, a national protest of more than 300,000 citizens dressed in white, demanding reform, transparency, and accountability. It was not just grief, it was fury at a system that had failed its most innocent. Forensic teams catalogued every corner of Dutroux's properties. They found blueprints, videotapes, and notes detailing abductions. He had dug tunnels under multiple houses, wired them for electricity, and recorded hours of footage documenting his crimes. Psychologists later described him as a technician of evil, meticulous, narcissistic, and devoid of empathy. When the case finally went to trial in 2004, the courtroom was overflowing. Survivors Sabine and Laetitia testified with extraordinary composure, recounting their captivity in haunting detail. Journalists described the silence in the room as almost sacred. Marc Dutroux was convicted on all counts: kidnapping, rape, and murder, and sentenced to life imprisonment. His wife, Michelle Martin, received 30 years for complicity, though her later parole release in 2012 reignited national outrage. The case left Belgium scarred but changed. It forced a restructuring of the police system, the creation of missing child task forces, and the founding of the Child Focus Organization. Even decades later, the name Dutroux remains a shorthand for institutional failure and the death of innocence, a father figure whose house became a tomb, and whose crimes forced a nation to look into its own abyss. When the Marc Dutroux verdict came down in 2004, Belgium didn't breathe a sigh of relief. It shuddered. The conviction closed a legal chapter, but the emotional wound it left across the country was far from healed. For nearly a decade, the case had exposed every crack in the nation's institutions, the police, the courts, even the government itself. And what followed was not just a criminal trial, but a moral reckoning. In the wake of Dutroux's arrest, Belgium had already erupted into outrage. The White March in 1996, a sea of 300,000 citizens dressed in white, wasn't just mourning for the murdered girls, it was a protest against failure. Parents marched beside police officers, priests, and teachers. Banners read, "Never again," and "Justice for our children." It was the largest public demonstration since World War II, a spontaneous outcry from a population that felt betrayed by those sworn to protect them. Investigations after the trial confirmed the fears many had voiced for years. Files had been misplaced. Tips from witnesses had been ignored. One policeman who searched Dutroux's house in 1995 had even heard faint cries from behind a false wall, but was ordered to leave after a brief inspection. That moment, in hindsight, became the symbol of the case's horror. Salvation was within reach, but bureaucracy turned away. The fallout reshaped Belgian law enforcement. Parliament commissioned sweeping reforms, merging police divisions, digitizing case management, and instituting new child protection protocols. The Federal Police and Child Focus Foundation were born from that outrage, ensuring that missing children's alerts would never again be buried under paperwork. But the deeper cultural scar was harder to mend. For years, Belgium's trust in authority remained shattered. Rumors of political cover-ups and elite networks spread through tabloids and late-night radio. Even now, mention of Dutroux's name evokes both revulsion and doubt, not only at what he did, but at how long he was allowed to do it. In the courtroom, survivors Sabine Dardenne and Laetitia Delhez became symbols of resilience. Their testimony, clear, unwavering, and painfully detailed, forced the world to see the human side of the tragedy. Sabine later wrote a memoir titled, "I Choose to Live," reclaiming her voice from the darkness Dutroux had imposed. Dutroux himself remains in solitary confinement, occasionally filing petitions for release that are swiftly denied. His wife, Michelle Martin, was granted parole in 2012 and moved into a convent, a decision that once again inflamed public anger. Outside the courthouse, protesters shouted, "No forgiveness for silence." 2 decades later, the Dutroux case still defines Belgium's modern identity, not only as a story of monstrous cruelty, but as a collective awakening. The tunnels he dug became a metaphor for the hidden rot beneath institutions once trusted without question. When journalists look back on the case, they often quote one of the fathers who lost a daughter. Standing before a wall of photographs at a vigil, he said softly, "We teach our children to fear the dark, but now we know the real danger comes from the light we thought protected them." It was a line that captured a nation's grief, and its resolve to never again let the facade of order silence the cries beneath it. On March 1st, 1976, a well-dressed man walked into a hardware store in Bethesda, Maryland, and bought a hammer, a gas can, and a shovel. His name was William Bradford Bishop Jr., a 39-year-old Yale-educated diplomat working for the U.S. State Department. By nightfall, his wife and 3 sons would be dead, and Bishop himself would vanish into one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. To friends and colleagues, Bishop was the image of success, intelligent, multilingual, and dedicated to public service. He'd served in Italy, Ethiopia, and Botswana, fluent in 5 languages and trusted with sensitive diplomatic assignments. His family, wife Annette, and sons Brad, Brenton, and Jeffrey, lived in a comfortable suburban home near Washington, D.C. To neighbors, they looked like the perfect American family. But under that facade was a man unraveling. Bishop had recently been passed over for a promotion, a humiliation that gnawed at his pride. Friends noticed his growing irritability and detachment. He told a colleague he felt invisible at work. To his psychiatrist, he confessed to bouts of depression and insomnia. The polished exterior, the diplomat's smile and steady handshake was beginning to crack. That March evening, he came home from the State Department, stopped by the local Sears to buy a hammer, and then at a gas station for fuel. What happened next can only be reconstructed through forensic fragments. Investigators believe he bludgeoned his wife while she read in bed, then killed his 3 sons, aged 5, 10, and 14, as they slept. When his mother arrived unexpectedly at the house later that night, he killed her too. The next morning, neighbors noticed the family's station wagon was gone. Inside the house, nothing seemed out of place except for one chilling detail. The family dog was outside, hungry and agitated. 2 days later, a park ranger near Columbia, North Carolina, discovered a shallow pit filled with burned remains. Among the ashes were fragments of a gas can, the head of a hammer, and traces of human bone and clothing consistent with the Bishop family. Dental records confirmed the victims. The bodies had been stacked, doused in gasoline, and set ablaze. The family's car was later found abandoned near a campground in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, hundreds of miles away. Inside were bloodstains, a blanket, and maps of the area. But Bishop himself had vanished. Theories multiplied. Some believed he fled into the mountains, dying there in anonymity. Others suspected he used his diplomatic skills and language fluency to escape abroad, possibly to Europe or Africa. Sightings poured in for decades: Stockholm, Switzerland, Italy, even South America. Each lead generated headlines, each ended in disappointment. In 2014, nearly 40 years after the murders, the FBI placed Bishop on its 10 most wanted list, describing him as intelligent, manipulative, and capable of blending into foreign communities. They released an age-progressed image, showing how he might look in his 70s, graying, but still refined. Tips surged again, but none produced a definitive match. What continues to haunt investigators isn't just the brutality of the act, but its methodical precision. Bishop's intelligence and training meant every trace of his disappearance was deliberate. No credit cards, no passport trail, no body. He had once studied survival techniques in remote regions, and he used that knowledge to erase himself. For the surviving relatives and detectives who have spent their careers chasing his shadow, the case embodies a terrifying question. How could a man so educated, so outwardly stable, commit such an atrocity, and then disappear so completely? Every few years, a new rumor reignites hope of closure. But until a body or confession emerges, William Bradford Bishop remains a ghost. The diplomat who destroyed his family, burned their remains, and walked into the night, leaving nothing behind but questions. In 2018, police in 3 US states would connect a trail of tragedy so tangled it seemed almost fictional. A crime born from obsession, confusion, and the darkest distortion of family love. At its center was Stephen Pladdle, a father from North Carolina, whose reunion with his long-lost daughter spiraled into one of the most disturbing murder-suicides in modern history. Stephen had been just 20 years old when he and his 15-year-old girlfriend, Alyssa, had their first child, a baby girl they named Denise. Struggling, immature, and overwhelmed, the young couple decided to give her up for adoption. They went on to marry, have 2 more children, and live what appeared to be a stable suburban life. But for Stephen, the memory of that first child never left. In 2016, 2 decades after the adoption, Denise, now Katie Rose Fusco, a college student curious about her origins, reached out to her birth parents. At first, it was a joyful reunion. Katie moved in with Stephen and Alyssa in their North Carolina home. Photos from those early months show smiling faces, awkward hugs, a family trying to stitch lost years together. But beneath the surface, something deeply wrong began to take root. Alyssa soon sensed that her husband's affection for their grown daughter had crossed boundaries. The two became increasingly inseparable: late-night conversations, whispered confidences, and a closeness that felt unnatural. Within months, Alyssa left the house, taking her younger daughters with her. Then came the revelation that stunned everyone who knew them. Stephen and Katie had begun a romantic relationship. They moved to Virginia, legally married under false pretenses, and posted photos online showing themselves in wedding attire, smiling like newlyweds. Their union produced a baby boy in 2017, an infant born of a relationship that blurred the lines between love, control, and delusion. When Alyssa learned of the marriage, she alerted authorities. The relationship, under North Carolina law, constituted incest, a felony. In early 2018, both Stephen and Katie were arrested and charged. Their infant son was placed in foster care. To the public, the case was a morbid curiosity. But to those involved, it was a slow-motion implosion of a family already lost to emotional corrosion. In court documents, Stephen's writings revealed a disturbing self-rationalization. He called the relationship spiritual and claimed it healed old wounds. Psychologists later described it as genetic sexual attraction, GSA, a rare but well-documented phenomenon in which separated biological relatives develop intense emotional and physical bonds upon reunion. But even that term could not account for the manipulation and dominance that defined Stephen's behavior. By April 2018, Katie had moved back in with her adoptive parents in New York, seeking distance from the chaos. She had reportedly ended the relationship and expressed regret. For Stephen, the rejection was catastrophic. On the morning of April 12, 2018, police in Knightdale, North Carolina, responded to a welfare check. Inside a parked car near Stephen's home, they found his body, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Hours earlier, officers in New Milford, Connecticut, had discovered 2 more victims, Katie and her adoptive father, both shot dead in their vehicle. Investigators pieced together the timeline. Stephen had driven over 600 miles in the night, tracked down his daughter and her adoptive father, killed them both, then driven home to end his own life. The case became a study in psychological collapse, how unresolved trauma, narcissism, and delusion could twist familial bonds into something monstrous. It also reignited debates around the responsibilities of mental health systems in recognizing signs of obsession before they erupt into tragedy. In the years since, the story of Stephen Pladdle has remained a grim reminder that evil sometimes wears the face of intimacy, that the same instinct meant to nurture and protect can, when corrupted, destroy everything it once claimed to love. As one officer who worked the case said quietly to reporters, "It wasn't about lust or anger. It was about possession. He didn't see her as a daughter or a partner. He saw her as something he owned." And with that, a father's final act became not reconciliation, but erasure of himself, his family, and every boundary that makes love human. When officers entered the quiet townhouse at 2002 Reserve Place, Celebration, Florida, in January 2020, they expected to serve a simple welfare check. What they found inside was a scene of eerie stillness, a home that smelled faintly of decay, blinds drawn tight, Christmas decorations still hanging in the heat of winter. On the couch sat Anthony Tott, dazed and pale. Upstairs, under blankets, lay the bodies of his wife Megan and their 3 children, Alec, Tyler, and Zoe. The family dog, Breezy, was also dead. To the world, Anthony Tott had seemed like the model suburban father, a physical therapist, husband, and devoted dad. He ran 2 clinics in Connecticut, coached his son's sports teams, and posted smiling family photos. They had recently moved to Florida, seeking what Megan called a new start in faith and simplicity. But behind those curated images was a life collapsing under debt, delusion, and denial. By late 2019, Tott's business was failing. He was deep in financial ruin, borrowing thousands just to stay afloat. Investigators later discovered multiple fraudulent billing schemes under his name. He'd been quietly under federal investigation, and he knew it. Friends noticed his behavior shifting: erratic religious talk, paranoia, sleeplessness. Megan's Facebook posts grew strange too, filled with mystical claims about purification and ascending together. On December 14, 2019, prosecutors believe Anthony made his fatal decision. Over the next several days, he drugged and smothered each member of his family. First Megan, then the children, all while texting relatives to suggest everything was fine. He remained in the house for weeks afterward, living among the corpses, telling investigators later that he believed they would resurrect together through divine power. When police finally entered in early January, they found Tott weak, cooperative, and disturbingly calm. He initially claimed Megan had killed the children, and then herself, but under questioning he confessed. His voice barely wavered as he described what he called a family suicide pact. Detectives described his tone as almost hypnotic, detached from reality, but fully aware of what he'd done. The autopsy told a different story. The children had been forcibly subdued. Megan had defensive wounds. Whatever delusion Tott believed, the evidence made clear this was not a pact, it was annihilation. During his 2022 trial, prosecutors painted a picture of quiet desperation turned to fanaticism. They presented journals showing Tott's obsession with an apocalyptic belief system, blending New Age mysticism, Catholic imagery, and doomsday theories. In his writings, he spoke of ascending as a unit and escaping the corrupted earth. His defense claimed mental illness, that he'd descended into psychosis driven by financial and spiritual breakdown. But the jury saw control, not chaos. They saw a man who planned each act, who stayed in the home afterward, feeding on denial. In April 2022, he was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder and animal cruelty. He received 4 consecutive life sentences without parole. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. One relative of Megan's whispered, "He killed everything he claimed to love." In the months after the trial, Anthony Tott sent handwritten letters from prison, insisting he was innocent, claiming again that his wife orchestrated the killings. But no one believed him. His letters, filled with religious rambling and self-justification, read more like confessions of ego than repentance. What makes the Tott case so haunting isn't just the brutality, it's the stillness of it. The image of a father who spent weeks in a home filled with death, convinced it was salvation. A man who mixed faith and madness until they were indistinguishable. In the end, the tragedy of Anthony Todt lies not just in the loss of his family, but in how he corrupted the very idea of love, turning it into a doctrine of destruction. He wanted to ascend with them to heaven. Instead, he buried them in silence. Fatherhood is meant to be the first line of safety, the quiet fortress every child trusts without question. Yet, in each of these stories, that fortress became the battleground. The men who should have protected life instead extinguished it, trading love for domination, care for control, and legacy for destruction. From John List's calculated slaughter to Chris Watts' suburban deceit, the pattern is hauntingly familiar. A man defined by pride, pressured by failure, and driven by an illusion of control. Whether cloaked in religion, duty, or despair, each believed himself justified, a protector, correcting what he saw as chaos. But beneath every justification lies the same truth, the fragile male ego collapsing under the weight of expectation. These fathers lived double lives. On the surface, family portraits, neighborhood barbecues, steady jobs. Beneath, quiet resentments, financial strain, secret affairs, delusions of grandeur. What unites them isn't madness in the clinical sense, but a slow moral corrosion, an erosion of empathy until the people they loved became obstacles rather than souls. Society often romanticizes the father figure, the provider, the disciplinarian, the pillar. But power without introspection becomes tyranny. In John List's world, faith became a weapon. In Josef Fritzl's, protection turned into imprisonment. In Ronald Simmons, patriarchal pride became a massacre. Each man saw himself not as a killer, but as a god of his household, with the right to decide who lived, who died, and who would remember him. What makes these cases linger isn't only their brutality, it's their betrayal. Murder by a stranger horrifies, but murder by a parent violates something sacred, the unspoken contract of unconditional safety. Every one of these crimes fractures that idea further, reminding us that evil isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes, it lives in a smile at the dinner table. Psychologists studying family annihilators note a chilling through line, control and image. These men feared humiliation more than prison, exposure more than guilt. When their power slipped, through debt, divorce, or loss of respect, they chose obliteration over vulnerability. Better to destroy the family than admit defeat. The tragedy deepens when faith, intellect, or authority joins the mix. From the diplomat William Bradford Bishop, who vanished after erasing his family, to Anthony Todt, who merged delusion with devotion, intelligence offered no immunity. In fact, it often armed them, teaching them to rationalize, to plan, to disguise. And yet, amid the horror, there's a faint but crucial pattern of resistance, the societies that refuse to forget. The neighbors who spoke up, the survivors who testified, the journalists and investigators who refused to let family tragedy become a euphemism for slaughter. In remembering, they reclaim the meaning of family, not as control, but as care. When fatherhood turns fatal, it doesn't just destroy a family, it shakes the foundation of every household that sees itself reflected in theirs. These men weren't monsters from birth. They were proof of what happens when love curdles into ownership, when masculinity becomes domination, when silence replaces empathy. As the last line of this dark ledger closes, the question remains, how many fathers hiding behind pride or faith or fear are one collapse away from the same abyss? Because the most terrifying part of these stories isn't that such men existed, it's that they looked for so long like fathers we thought we knew.